This week in W301, W611, we're focused on plotting. And we're going to spend some time this week on H.P. Lovecraft's longer story, The Shadow Out of Time. And we're going to think about the layers of plotting that are in this, as well as the plotting of an individual scene within that longer story. One of the things that you want to think about at the outset of this story is how much it depends on kind of exploring the layers of human consciousness, the layers of both the kind of waking thoughts of the narrator in this story, as well as kind of how he plumbs his subconscious as well, as in trying to figure out what's happening as the story develops. So a lot of the storytelling here is through movements in time. Some of you have practiced this in terms of flashbacks in narration, where the character goes back in memory. There's also other kinds of flashback that are kind of present here in terms of subconscious worlds that the narrator participates in. For instance, in dreams, in memory, and in thinking through the waking moments and how those things connect to the past. So the character is kind of unstuck in time as well as in place as the story develops. As the story goes on, one question you might ask yourself is, where is horror located in consciousness? Is horror much more kind of a waking phenomenon, where you see something and you feel its immediate impact upon you? Or does horror have some connection to memory as well? Think about narration of trauma here psychologically, and how that can impact your sense of horror. And so Lovecraft's narrator here, in what ways, in what levels of consciousness does he find horror? Also, think about like how you experience time, and it's an interesting moment to be thinking about time, right? That sense of being socially distant from others, where time seems to dissolve as a measured entity, right? One day kind of bleeds into another, and so all time seems the same. What ways do we experience time perhaps as dread, as the character here does for Lovecraft? And how is that different from discovery within moments of time, much like science's impulses are? What ways does the experience of deep, kind of unmeasured time prompt a sense of dread for the character here, and perhaps in your own experience in this particular moment? I want to think about like different kinds of layers of narrative that are here, different parts of narrative as Lovecraft unwinds this longer story. First, how does the narrator's dissolution become a story in a way, right? Is the narrator coming apart psychologically? And as he does, do you read Nathaniel Wingate Peaslee as a reliable narrator? Do you trust his story as the plot unwinds? And how does that impact your sense of what's happening in Lovecraft's story? There are very obsessive aspects to the way that he gives his account here. In some ways, it's a confession of his own madness. Do you trust his mental balance as attention? He certainly calls that up at different points, right? In what ways does he try to maintain a sense of mental balance here? It's an interesting, narrative. In what ways do your own characters, as you write, have a clear sense of the world, or how does a recovery of a clear sense of the world, or a dissolving sense of the world, impact the way you think about plot and storytelling? He references his own queer amnesia, right? Moments where he recalls a strange secondary life that's outside of his present conception of time. And then what he remembers versus what he forgets becomes an important kind of conflict that goes on within himself. Does he trust secondary sources, right? Historians' accounts of time versus his own experience of a deeper time. That also becomes a point of conflict within the character here. He reconstructs his own timeline, right? As he notes early in the story, the real horror began in May 1915. So we're in the era of World War I. And Peaslee starts to have these strange dreams of being in another time. He's also we have to think about the fact that he's outside the story, thinking back on the events of the story, particularly this night of July 17th and 18th in 1935 in Western Australia, when he goes deep into the earth to kind of recover a sense of who he is and was in this deeper time. So as he notes, there's a secret knowledge that festers in the chasms of my subconscious, right? And getting back to that secret knowledge is part of the plot of the story. Will that journey take him apart, or will it complete him and help him to resolve his sense of time? And in what ways does he experience the whole of time as a horror? As he reconstructs the story, does that offer him solace, or does that perhaps cause him to become more to become more fragmented in his consciousness? How could I bear to live any longer, he asks on page 394, knowing the fullness of time. A central point of the storytelling here is the conflict of the human and non-human worlds, and this is kind of an essential part of Lovecraft's storytelling. That what you have here is Peaslee as a memory that subtly holds the pre-human world of the mighty beetle civilization, and this is not the Beatles, the rock group, but this is this other race of beings who were here in pre-human days and gained a sense of how to travel through time, and through this mastery of time they can affect things happening in other historical moments, and they abduct people and beings from other moments and bring them back into their own time as a means of trying to find a way to stave off their own kind of inevitable decay and collapse as a civilization. The narrator's experience of this conflict of the human and non-human worlds is the center of the story in a lot of ways. That he experiences the lives of other captive minds, of other beings here, where there were sometimes forced re-exchanges were affected, where they force people and other beings to move through time, like I say, in tasks that would try to stave off their own inevitable decay. Part of that experience of the conflict of the human and non-human worlds is the journey to Western Australia that the narrator takes in summer of 1935. There's the discovery of these giant half-buried blocks that kind of shakes the narrator's imagination and memory, and he has to go see these things. He cannot describe his emotions when he first sees the half-buried blocks in June of 1935, that he sees a terrible pseudo-familiarity about the blocks, a persistent illusion of memory, right, that he can recall through seeing these blocks as they're pulled up, that he's brought back into this non-human world that he's journeyed to, been abducted from present time and taken back to in some ways. And it prompts his exploration of an underworld deep under this Western Australian desert, where he experiences that underworld as a kind of traumatized space, a space that he was held captive in. And there he finds had reposed the whole history of cosmic space-time. So he comes face to face with the wideness of time suddenly, and its impact on him is a significant part of the story. Does it allow him to find some resolution to that time and experience, or does it cause him to come further apart? And as he goes into that underworld, he notes, what I dreaded and expected was there. And so he comes face to face with memory that is very reliable, to him at least. And the question is, what ways do you see it as reliable as well? There are other kinds of narratives that are engaged within Lovecraft's story. One is history and how it serves as a frame for this story. And within the story, we're in the years of World War I and the years following, leading up to World War II. So as the narrator begins to have these strange dreams and moments of recollection, The United States is not quite in World War I, but World War I has started. And as the narrator's dreams resurface and continue into his experience of Western Australia in 1935, the Nazis have come to power in Germany. So there's a sense in which how does the narrator measure history's cosmic savagery against the myths of a deep past or a primeval world? How do we think of history as its own kind of like narrative or story that has deep meanings for us as a people? In what ways were those kinds of things invoked by the Nazis in their rise to power in Germany? A sense of deep past or recovering a deep past, and how are those stories used to kind of unleash a cosmic kind of savagery in World War II? The narrator already kind of is a lightning rod for this coming violence, and he notes, in autumn of 1914, I began to have infrequent dreams of strange floatings over the city. And so he starts to kind of be cut loose from time and starts to feel himself moving in time through dreams, through recollection, through memory, all those things. So history is a significant part, I think, of how those experiences are framed. And the recovery of memory here is an important narrative as well for the narrator, right? That sense of how he recovers his own sense of abduction, his own sense of conflict with this, deep non-human world. As Lovecraft writes on 350 to 351, primal myth and modern delusion joined in their assumption that mankind is only one, perhaps the least, of a highly evolved and dominant races of this planet's long and largely unknown career, versus a relatively late race which had conquered time to project themselves into the past and future. The narrator comes to an awareness of movement through time and how this other non-human race had affected that within his own consciousness. That his movement through memory becomes a means of recovering that story, but what is the effect of recovering that story in the end? Is that something that allows him to be resolved about time, or does it just awaken in him a conscious sense of dread that this other world exists out there and is ready to return, which returns us as readers to that sense of what's monstrous in all of Lovecraft's storytelling, that sense that there is some outside force outside the human being that invokes horror. As he writes earlier in the story, what came from somewhere else, a dying elder world, right? That this world is there and it's just on the edge of our world and it's ready to reassert itself with power in our own lives as human beings. This non-human world that contributes to, as Lovecraft writes, mythic fears, a horrible elder race coming doom and leaving us with a sense of cautious vigilance that's there. So this encroaching other world is the center of Lovecraft's horror, and it is through that the sense of that world that he develops the plot in this story. Thanks.